The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Windsor Castle as Tom Parker Bowles adjusted his formal uniform one last time. Today was the annual royal parade, a tradition that brought together the entire extended royal family in a grand display of British heritage and unity. As the stepson of Queen Camilla, Tom had always felt the weight of expectations, but today something felt different. There was a tension in the air that he couldn't quite place. Tom stood before the ornate mirror in his guest chambers, straightening his ceremonial medals. At 48 years old, he had learned to navigate the complex world of royal protocol, but he had never quite shaken the feeling of being an outsider looking in. His mother's marriage to King Charles had thrust him into a spotlight he never wanted, and the constant comparison to the real royals had worn him down over the years. The grand hallway echoed with the sound of polished boots as Tom made his way toward the assembly point. Portraits of long-dead monarchs seemed to watch him with disapproving eyes, their stern faces a reminder of the centuries of tradition he was now part of, whether he liked it or not. The smell of fresh flowers from the arrangements prepared for the parade mixed with the musty scent of the ancient castle walls. Prince William stood at the center of the gathering, his commanding presence immediately drawing attention. Even in casual conversation with other family members, there was an air of authority about him that came naturally. He was discussing the parade route with several senior officials, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who had been groomed for leadership his entire life. Tom approached the group slowly, feeling the familiar knot of anxiety in his stomach. He had never been comfortable in large gatherings, especially when they involved formal ceremonies. The weight of his uniform felt heavier with each step, and he found himself questioning once again whether he truly belonged in this world of crowns and ceremonies. "Good morning, Tom," Prince William said with a polite smile as he noticed his approach. The greeting was warm enough, but Tom detected something beneath the surface, a subtle reminder of hierarchy that always seemed to exist in their interactions. "Morning, William," Tom replied, deliberately omitting the formal title. It was a small act of rebellion that he had practiced over the years, a way of asserting some independence in a world where everything was dictated by protocol. The other family members continued their conversations, but Tom noticed the slight shift in atmosphere when he joined the group. It wasn't overt hostility, but rather a subtle adjustment that reminded everyone of the social dynamics at play. Tom was family, yes, but he was family by marriage, not by blood. As they walked toward the carriages that would take them through the parade route, Tom found himself walking slightly behind the main group. It was a position he had grown accustomed to, close enough to be included, but far enough back to remember his place in the hierarchy. The sound of his footsteps seemed to echo differently than those around him, as if even the ancient stones of the castle recognized the difference. The carriages were magnificent, each one a masterpiece of craftsmanship that had been maintained for generations. The golden carriage that would carry the senior royals gleamed in the morning sunlight, its elaborate decorations telling the story of British history through intricate metalwork and precious stones. Tom had ridden in these carriages before, but he never stopped being amazed by their opulence. Prince William climbed into the lead carriage with practiced ease, his movements fluid and natural. This was his world, and it showed in every gesture. Tom watched from a distance, feeling like an actor who had forgotten his lines in the middle of a performance. "Tom, you'll be in the third carriage," announced an aide, consulting a clipboard with the careful precision that characterized all royal events. Tom nodded, accepting his assigned position without comment. He had learned long ago that questioning the arrangements only led to uncomfortable conversations about protocol and tradition. As he settled into his designated seat, Tom looked out at the crowds already gathering along the parade route. Thousands of people had come to witness this display of royal pageantry, their faces filled with excitement and anticipation. Children sat on their parents' shoulders, waving small Union Jack flags, while elderly spectators brought folding chairs and thermos flasks of tea. The parade began with the sound of military bands striking up the traditional marches that had accompanied royal processions for centuries. The music filled the air with a sense of grandeur and importance, but Tom felt oddly detached from it all. He waved mechanically at the crowds, his smile feeling forced and unnatural. From his position in the third carriage, Tom had a clear view of Prince William in the lead vehicle. The future king waved with genuine warmth at the crowds, his every movement captured by the dozens of photographers lining the route. Flash bulbs popped like fireworks, creating a constant strobe effect that would later fill newspaper front pages around the world. The crowd's enthusiasm was infectious, their cheers and applause creating a wave of sound that followed the procession along its route. But, as Tom continued to wave and smile, he found his thoughts drifting to darker places. The constant reminder of his secondary status, the subtle slights that accumulated over years, the feeling that he would always be viewed as an outsider, it all began to weigh on him more heavily than usual. A group of schoolchildren near the roadside caught his attention, their faces glowing with excitement as they spotted the royal carriages. One little girl, no more than 7 years old, pointed directly at Tom and shouted something to her friend. Tom couldn't hear her words over the noise of the crowd, but her enthusiasm was unmistakable. For a moment, Tom felt a genuine smile cross his face. These children didn't care about bloodlines or protocol, they simply saw the magic of the moment. But even that innocent joy was tinged with irony for Tom. These children would grow up learning about the real royals, the ones whose pictures would be in their history books and on their currency. Tom would be a footnote at best, remembered only as the stepson who happened to be there. The procession continued through the historic streets, past landmarks that had witnessed centuries of royal ceremonies. Each building seemed to hold memories of past parades, past celebrations, past reminders of a continuity that Tom felt disconnected from. The weight of history was both inspiring and oppressive, a reminder of traditions that stretched back far beyond his understanding. As they approached the halfway point of the route, Tom noticed Prince William turning back to acknowledge the other carriages. It was a gracious gesture, meant to include the extended family in the celebration. But, when William's eyes met Tom's, there was something in that look, a subtle assessment, perhaps, or a reminder of respective positions, that triggered something deep within Tom. The anger that had been building for years, carefully controlled and professionally managed, began to simmer closer to the surface. Tom had always prided himself on his discretion, his ability to navigate royal protocol without causing embarrassment. But, today, surrounded by the pomp and circumstance that highlighted his outsider status, he felt his carefully constructed composure beginning to crack. The crowds continued to cheer, the bands continued to play, and the carriages continued their stately progress through the streets of Windsor. But, inside the third carriage, Tom Parker Bowles was wrestling with emotions that threatened to overwhelm the careful control he had maintained for so many years. The perfect royal facade was beginning to show its first cracks, and what lay beneath was far more complicated than the smiling public image suggested. As the parade neared its end, Tom knew that something fundamental had shifted inside him. The careful balance he had maintained between his private feelings and his public role was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. The seeds of the confrontation that would soon shock the royal family and the world were being planted in the fertile ground of years of accumulated resentment and frustration. The golden carriage ahead continued its majestic journey, carrying its precious cargo of real royalty toward whatever destiny awaited them. But, in the third carriage, Tom Parker Bowles was beginning a journey of his own, one that would lead him to a moment of truth that would change everything. The reception following the parade was held in the state dining room of Windsor Castle, a magnificent chamber that had hosted countless royal celebrations over the centuries. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables laden with the finest china and silver, while staff in pristine uniforms moved silently among the guests, ensuring that every detail was perfect. Tom entered the room feeling the weight of the morning's events still pressing on his shoulders. The parade had ended without incident, but the internal storm that had been brewing throughout the procession showed no signs of calming. If anything, the transition from the public ceremony to this more intimate gathering seemed to intensify his feelings of displacement. Prince William stood near the center of the room, already surrounded by a small crowd of admirers and dignitaries. His wife Catherine had joined him, and, together they formed the kind of perfect royal couple that photographers dreamed of capturing. Their easy charm and natural grace made conversation flow effortlessly, and, even from across the room, Tom could see how everyone gravitated toward them. The contrast with his own position couldn't have been more stark. Tom found himself standing near the edge of the gathering, holding a crystal glass of champagne that he hadn't touched. Several people had approached him with polite conversation, but the interactions felt stilted and formal. Everyone knew exactly who he was and why he was there, but that knowledge seemed to create distance rather than connection. Queen Camilla appeared at his elbow, her presence both comforting and complicated. As his mother, she understood his struggles better than anyone, but, as the queen, she was also part of the system that seemed to emphasize his outsider status. "You seem troubled, darling," she said quietly, her voice carrying the maternal concern that she had never quite been able to suppress, even in the most formal settings. "Just tired from the parade," Tom replied, though they both knew it was far more complicated than simple fatigue. The careful dance they had all learned to perform around his feelings was wearing thin, and, today it felt particularly hollow. Camilla studied his face for a moment, her experienced eyes reading the signs of distress that he thought he had been hiding. "Perhaps we should talk later, privately," she suggested, but Tom shook his head. "I'm fine, Mother." "Really?" The lie sat uncomfortably between them, but Camilla didn't push. She had learned over the years that Tom's pride was both his greatest strength and his greatest weakness. Pushing too hard would only make him retreat further into himself. As the afternoon wore on, Tom found himself observing the intricate social dynamics that played out around him. There was an unspoken hierarchy that governed every interaction, from who spoke first in conversations to who received the most attention from the media representatives present. It was subtle but unmistakable, and Tom's position in that hierarchy was becoming increasingly clear to him. The moment that would change everything began innocuously enough. Tom had been standing near a group of younger royals who were discussing upcoming charitable events. The conversation was light and friendly, the kind of casual chat that helped bridge the gap between formal duties and family relationships. Prince William approached the group, his presence immediately shifting the dynamic. Everyone turned toward him with the automatic deference that his position commanded, and Tom watched as the conversation reorganized itself around William's participation. "Tom," William said, nodding in his direction. "I don't think we've had a chance to catch up properly today. How are you finding everything?" The question seemed innocent enough, but something in William's tone struck Tom as patronizing. Perhaps it was the way he emphasized properly, or maybe it was the slight smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Whatever it was, it felt like a subtle reminder of the gulf between their positions. "Everything's fine, William," Tom replied, his voice carrying just a hint of edge that only those who knew him well would recognize. "Good," William continued, apparently oblivious to the undercurrent of tension. "I know these formal events can be overwhelming for some people. The protocol, the media attention, it takes some getting used to." The words hit Tom like a physical blow. The casual assumption that he was struggling to keep up, the gentle condescension disguised as concern, it was everything that had been building inside him for years, crystallized in a single moment. Several people in the immediate vicinity had heard the exchange, and Tom was acutely aware of their attention shifting between him and William. The room seemed to grow quieter around them, as if sensing that something significant was about to happen. "Overwhelming?" Tom repeated, his voice carefully controlled but with an unmistakable hardness beneath the surface. "I've been part of this family for nearly 20 years, William. I think I've got the hang of it by now." William's eyebrows rose slightly at the unexpected sharpness in Tom's response. The easy smile faltered for just a moment, replaced by a look of confusion and, perhaps a touch of annoyance. "Of course," William said, his tone becoming noticeably cooler. "I didn't mean to suggest otherwise. I was simply being considerate." Considerate, Tom repeated, the word dripping with barely contained sarcasm. How very thoughtful of you. The conversation around them had stopped entirely now, creating a bubble of tense silence in the midst of the larger reception. Tom could feel eyes turning toward them from across the room, sensing drama even if they couldn't hear the specific words being exchanged. Catherine appeared at William's side, her diplomat's instincts alert to the potential for trouble. Perhaps we should, she began, but Tom cut her off. No, Catherine. I think it's time we had an honest conversation about consideration and thoughtfulness in this family. William's face was beginning to show signs of real irritation now. As the future king, he was accustomed to deference and respect even from family members. Tom's obvious challenge to his authority was both unexpected and unwelcome. I'm not sure what you're implying, Tom, William said, his royal training keeping his voice level despite the growing tension. But perhaps this isn't the appropriate time or place for whatever grievance you think you have. The word grievance was the final straw. Years of accumulated slights, subtle dismissals, and careful reminders of his place in the hierarchy came rushing to the surface. Tom felt something snap inside him, a careful restraint that had been holding back a flood of resentment and anger. Grievance? Tom's voice rose just enough to carry across the immediate area. You want to talk about grievances, William? Let's talk about being treated like a second-class member of this family for 20 years. Let's talk about being constantly reminded that I don't really belong here. The room was beginning to take notice now. Conversations were trailing off as people turned to see what was causing the disturbance. Queen Camilla had started moving in their direction, her face a mask of concern and embarrassment. Tom, that's enough, William said, his authority finally beginning to show through his carefully maintained composure. You're making a scene. Am I? Tom replied, his voice now clearly audible to much of the room. Well, heaven forbid we should have a scene. We wouldn't want to disturb the perfect royal image, would we? The confrontation was escalating rapidly, moving beyond the point where it could be quietly contained or diplomatically resolved. Tom could see the shock and disapproval on the faces around him, but, rather than deterring him, it seemed to fuel his anger further. Years of careful self-control were crumbling away, replaced by a raw honesty that felt both terrifying and liberating. Tom knew he was crossing lines that could never be uncrossed, burning bridges that could never be rebuilt, but, in that moment, he no longer cared about the consequences. The Golden Room with its perfect appointments and carefully orchestrated elegance suddenly felt like a prison to him. The weight of expectation, the burden of always being on his best behavior, the constant awareness of his secondary status, it all came crashing down in a moment of explosive truth. William stood facing him, his future king's composure beginning to crack under the unprecedented challenge to his authority. The man who would one day rule over millions was being publicly confronted by his step-uncle, and the shock of it was written clearly on his face. The stage was set for words that would echo far beyond the walls of Windsor Castle, words that would shatter the careful facade of royal unity and expose the human tensions that lay beneath the crown's glittering surface. Tom Parker Bowles was about to say something that would change everything, and, in that moment, he felt both the terror and the freedom that comes with finally telling the truth. The silence in the state dining room had become oppressive, a heavy blanket that seemed to muffle even the sound of breathing. Tom Parker Bowles stood facing Prince William, 20 years of suppressed frustration and resentment finally bubbling to the surface. The carefully maintained facade of royal harmony was about to shatter in spectacular fashion. You want to know what I really think about all this? Tom continued, his voice carrying across the room with stunning clarity. You want to know what it's like to be constantly reminded that I'm not really family, just some inconvenient addition that came with the package? William's face had gone pale, his usual composure completely abandoned as he realized the magnitude of what was unfolding. This wasn't just a minor family disagreement that could be smoothed over with diplomatic words and private conversations. This was a public explosion that would have consequences far beyond this room. Tom, please, Queen Camilla had reached them now, her voice tight with panic and embarrassment. Not here, not like this. But Tom was beyond the reach of maternal intervention. The dam had burst, and 20 years of carefully controlled emotions were pouring out in a torrent that couldn't be stopped. Not here? Tom turned to his mother, his eyes blazing with hurt and anger. When then, Mother? When is it ever appropriate to talk about how your precious royal family really works? When is it okay to mention that some of us are just window dressing for the real show? The other guests in the room had formed a rough circle around the confrontation, some trying to look away out of politeness, others openly staring in fascination and horror. This kind of raw, unfiltered drama was unprecedented in their carefully choreographed world. Prince William found his voice again, though it was strained and unfamiliar. You're out of line, Tom. Completely out of line. This behavior is, what? Tom interrupted, stepping closer to William with an intensity that made several security personnel shift nervously. Unbecoming? Inappropriate? Not suitable for a member of the royal family? Well, here's a newsflash for you, Your Royal Highness, I never asked to be part of your bloody family. The profanity hung in the air like a physical presence. In a world where every word was carefully chosen and measured, where crude language was absolutely forbidden in formal settings, Tom's outburst was like a bomb exploding in a cathedral. Catherine had moved to stand protectively near her husband, her diplomatic training warring with her natural instinct to defend her family. Her face showed the strain of trying to find some way to diffuse the situation, but it was clear that normal solutions wouldn't work here. And you, Tom continued, his attention shifting back to William with laser focus, you've spent years making sure I know exactly where I stand in your little hierarchy. Always the polite acknowledgement, always the careful distance. Never quite rude enough to be called out, but never warm enough to forget that I'm not really one of you. William's jaw tightened, his royal training warring with very human emotions. That's not true, and you know it. You've always been treated as family, family? Tom's laugh was harsh and bitter. Is that what you call it? Being seated 3 carriages back in the parade? Being introduced as Queen Camilla's son rather than as a family member? Being relegated to the sidelines of every major event while the real royals take center stage? The accusations were precise and devastating, each one hitting its target with surgical accuracy. Everyone in the room knew that Tom was speaking truths that were normally left unspoken, exposing the careful social engineering that kept the royal hierarchy functioning smoothly. Tom, you need to stop this right now, William said, his voice carrying the full weight of his future authority. You're embarrassing yourself and your mother, and you're creating a situation that will have serious consequences. The threat was unmistakable, and it seemed to ignite something even more explosive in Tom's already volatile emotional state. Serious consequences? Tom's voice rose to a level that could be heard clearly throughout the room. You mean like being even more marginalized than I already am? Like being cut out of family events entirely? Like having my children treated as distant cousins rather than family? This mention of the next generation seemed to strike a particularly sensitive nerve. Several people in the room exchanged meaningful glances, understanding that Tom had just crossed into territory that made this about more than just his own feelings. Queen Camilla looked stricken, caught between her loyalty to her husband's family and her love for her son. King Charles, who had been across the room in conversation with government officials, was making his way toward them with obvious urgency, but the crowd made his progress slow. Your children are treated perfectly well, William replied, but there was less conviction in his voice now. The mention of the younger generation had reminded him that this wasn't just about Tom's hurt feelings, it was about the future of family relationships that extended beyond the immediate confrontation. Are they? Tom demanded. Really? When was the last time any of them were included in a major royal event? When was the last time their accomplishments were acknowledged by this family? They're treated like distant relatives at a family reunion, politely acknowledged but never truly included. The pain in Tom's voice when he spoke about his children was unmistakable and heartbreaking. This wasn't just about his own wounded pride, this was about a father's anguish over how his family had been treated by the institution they were supposed to be part of. And, here's the real truth that nobody wants to talk about, Tom continued, his voice now carrying a dangerous edge that made everyone in the room tense. This whole perfect royal image is built on lies and careful manipulation. The unity, the harmony, the big happy family, it's all performance art for the public. William's face had gone from pale to flushed, his careful control finally beginning to crack under the relentless assault. You don't know what you're talking about. You don't understand the pressures, the responsibilities, I don't understand. Tom's interruption was like a slap. I've been watching this performance for 20 years, William. I've seen how the sausage gets made. I know exactly how much of this is real and how much is just carefully crafted public relations. The room had gone completely silent now, even the service staff had stopped moving. Everyone understood that they were witnessing something unprecedented, a complete breakdown of the carefully maintained fiction that held the royal family's public image together. But, here's what really gets me, Tom continued, his voice dropping to a more conversational level that somehow made his words even more devastating. You all act like I should be grateful for the scraps of inclusion I get. Like being allowed to ride in the third carriage is some kind of honor I should appreciate. Like being seated at the family table is a privilege I shouldn't take for granted. King Charles had finally reached the edge of the confrontation, his face a mixture of confusion, anger, and deep concern. This was exactly the kind of public relations disaster that the monarchy had worked for decades to avoid, and it was unfolding in front of dozens of witnesses including members of the press. Well, I'm done being grateful for scraps, Tom declared, his voice carrying a finality that chilled everyone who heard it. I'm done pretending that this dysfunctional circus is actually a loving family. And I'm especially done pretending to respect people who've spent years making sure I know I don't really belong here. The words hung in the air like an accusation and a challenge rolled into one. Tom had finally said what everyone in the room had always known but never acknowledged, that the royal family's public image of unity and harmony was, at least partly, a carefully maintained illusion. But he wasn't finished yet. The expression on his face suggested that the most devastating revelation was still to come, and everyone in the room seemed to sense it. The silence stretched taut as they waited for the other shoe to drop, for whatever final truth Tom Parker Bowles was preparing to unleash on the stunned gathering. The tension in the state dining room had reached a breaking point. Tom Parker Bowles stood in the center of what felt like a hurricane of shocked silence, his face showing the wild expression of a man who had finally decided to burn down everything he had spent years carefully building. The gathered crowd of dignitaries, family members, and staff waited with bated breath for whatever devastating words would come next. King Charles had positioned himself where he could intervene if necessary, but his face showed the paralyzed expression of someone watching a catastrophe unfold in slow motion. 20 years of careful family diplomacy were crumbling before his eyes, and there seemed to be nothing he could do to stop it. But, you know what the most pathetic part of all this is? Tom continued, his voice now carrying a deadly calm that was somehow more frightening than his earlier outbursts. The most ridiculous part of this whole charade is that we're all pretending we don't see what's really going on. Queen Camilla's face had gone ashen, her eyes wide with the growing realization that her son was about to cross a line from which there would be no return. She reached out toward him, her maternal instincts overriding protocol, but Tom stepped away from her outstretched hand. Tom, please, she whispered, her voice barely audible but carrying a desperation that everyone in the immediate vicinity could feel. Think about what you're doing. I am thinking, Mother, Tom replied, his eyes never leaving Prince William's face. I'm thinking about 20 years of watching this family operate behind closed doors. 20 years of seeing how things really work when the cameras aren't rolling and the press isn't watching. The implications of his words sent a visible shiver through the assembled crowd. everyone understood that Tom was positioning himself to reveal secrets that were meant to stay hidden, information that could damage not just individual reputations but the entire institution of the monarchy. Prince William seemed to sense the danger as well. His face showed a mixture of anger and genuine fear as he realized that his step-uncle was prepared to weaponize years of insider knowledge in the most public way possible. "Whatever you think you know," William said, his voice tight with controlled fury, "whatever twisted version of events you've constructed in your mind, you need to keep it to yourself. Some things are private family matters that, private?" Tom's interruption was like a gunshot in the quiet room. "You want to talk about private family matters, William? You want to discuss what happens behind closed doors in this perfect royal household?" The threat was unmistakable now. Tom had moved beyond general complaints about his treatment and was clearly preparing to reveal specific information that could cause serious damage. The shift was palpable, and several people in the room began moving toward the exits, instinctively understanding that they didn't want to be present for whatever was about to be revealed. "Let's talk about private family matters," Tom continued, his voice carrying the deadly precision of someone who had been planning this moment for years. "Let's discuss the real relationships in this family, the ones that don't make it into the official biographies and carefully staged photo opportunities." Queen Camilla made another desperate attempt to reach her son. "Tom, I'm begging you. Please don't do this. Think about the consequences, think about your children, think about my children?" Tom's laugh was harsh and bitter. "You want me to think about my children? That's rich, coming from someone who's spent years allowing them to be treated as second-class family members." The attack on his mother seemed to cross a line even for Tom, and several people in the room visibly recoiled. Attacking the hierarchy was one thing, but turning on Queen Camilla herself suggested that his emotional breakdown had reached a truly dangerous level. "And, speaking of my mother," Tom continued, his voice now carrying a vicious edge that made everyone in earshot deeply uncomfortable, "let's talk about the real story of how she became part of this precious royal family. Let's discuss what really happened during those years when she was supposedly just a friend of the family." The blood drained from Camilla's face as she realized where her son was heading. This wasn't just about his own grievances anymore, he was preparing to expose family secrets that could destroy reputations and relationships that had been carefully rebuilt over decades. King Charles stepped forward, his face showing an expression of authority and anger that few people had ever seen from him. "That is quite enough," he said, his voice carrying the full weight of royal command. "You will stop this immediately." But Tom was beyond the reach of royal authority now. The careful respect for hierarchy that had governed his behavior for 2 decades had been completely abandoned, replaced by a reckless honesty that recognized no boundaries. "Will I?" Tom challenged, turning to face his stepfather directly. "And what will you do if I don't, Charles? Have me arrested? Cut me off from the family? Pretend I never existed?" He laughed bitterly. "You've been doing that for years anyway." The direct challenge to the king's authority was unprecedented. Even family members who disagreed with royal decisions were expected to maintain a basic level of respect and deference, especially in public settings. Tom's open defiance was shocking in its boldness and its implications. "You know what I think the public deserves to know?" Tom continued, his voice rising again as he addressed the room at large. "They deserve to know the truth about what this family is really like. They deserve to understand that all the carefully staged unity and harmony is nothing but elaborate theater." Several members of the press who had been present for the reception were now actively taking notes, their professional instincts overriding any social discomfort they might have felt about the situation. This was the kind of insider revelation that could make careers and sell millions of newspapers. "And, since we're being honest about family relationships," Tom said, his voice now carrying a tone of malicious satisfaction, "maybe it's time to talk about some of the more interesting dynamics that the public never gets to see." The phrase "interesting dynamics" sent a chill through everyone present. It was clear that Tom was building toward a revelation that would be far more damaging than anything he had said so far, something that would cross the line from family grievances into genuinely destructive territory. Prince William seemed to understand the danger better than anyone. His face showed the kind of desperate calculation that comes when someone realizes they're standing on the edge of a cliff with nowhere to retreat. "Tom, if you say another word," William began, but Tom cut him off with a gesture that was almost theatrical in its dismissiveness. "You'll what, William? What exactly will you do?" "Because here's the thing about having nothing left to lose, it's actually quite liberating." The room held its collective breath as Tom paused, clearly savoring the moment before delivering whatever devastating blow he had been building toward. His eyes swept across the assembled crowd, taking in the shocked faces, the nervous whispers, the barely contained panic of people who suddenly found themselves in the middle of a royal crisis unlike anything in recent memory. "You want to know about interesting family dynamics?" Tom asked, his voice now soft and deadly. "Well, let me tell you about some conversations I've overheard, some late-night phone calls, some very private moments that maybe weren't as private as people thought." The silence that followed was so complete that it seemed to have physical weight. Everyone in the room understood that they were about to witness the destruction of carefully maintained secrets, the exposure of information that could change everything about how the royal family was perceived by the public. Tom Parker Bowles stood at the center of it all, no longer the quiet, diplomatic family member who had spent years avoiding controversy. He had become something far more dangerous, a man with nothing left to lose and access to secrets that could bring down the very institution he had once tried so hard to serve. The words that Tom Parker Bowles spoke next would echo through the corridors of royal power for years to come, but, in the moment, they fell into the silence of the state dining room like stones into still water, creating ripples that would spread far beyond anyone's ability to contain them. "Since we're all here together, playing happy families," Tom said, his voice carrying a deadly calm, "maybe it's time someone mentioned the elephant in the room. Maybe it's time to talk about the late-night phone calls between certain family members that have nothing to do with official business." Queen Camilla's sharp intake of breath was audible throughout the room. Her face had gone completely white, and, for a moment, it seemed as though she might faint. King Charles moved instinctively toward her, but his own face showed the stunned expression of someone watching their worst nightmares come to life. "You see," Tom continued, seemingly oblivious to the devastation his words were causing, "when you live on the periphery of this family for 20 years, you notice things. You overhear conversations. You see patterns of behavior that the general public never gets to witness." Prince William looked as though he had been physically struck. The confident authority that usually characterized his demeanor had completely evaporated, replaced by something much more vulnerable and human. His hands had clenched into fists at his sides, whether from anger or desperation, it was impossible to tell. "Tom," King Charles said, his voice carrying a note of pleading that was shocking coming from a monarch, "you don't understand what you're doing. The damage you're causing, the damage I'm causing?" Tom's laugh was sharp and bitter. "That's rich, coming from you. What about the damage that's been done to me? To my children? What about 20 years of being treated like an inconvenient afterthought?" The pain in his voice was unmistakable now, cutting through the anger and revealing the deep hurt that had been driving his actions. This wasn't just about revenge or spite, this was about a man who had reached the absolute limit of his ability to pretend that everything was fine. "But, you know what really broke my heart?" Tom continued, his voice becoming quieter but somehow more devastating. "It wasn't the slights or the careful distance or even the way my children have been marginalized. It was realizing that some of the people I thought I could trust, some of the relationships I thought were genuine, were built on lies and manipulation." The assembled crowd was beginning to understand that they were witnessing not just a public relations disaster, but a genuine human tragedy. Tom Parker Bowles was a man in the midst of an emotional breakdown, 20 years of suppressed feelings finally erupting in the worst possible circumstances. "I've heard things," Tom said, his eyes focusing on specific faces in the crowd. Private conversations that were never meant for my ears. Comments about how to handle me, how to keep me happy without actually including me. Discussions about damage control and public perception that treated my feelings like a public relations problem to be managed. Each word seemed to hit its target with surgical precision. Several people in the room looked genuinely stricken, their faces showing the guilt of people whose private conversations were being exposed in the most public way possible. Queen Camilla finally found her voice, though it was barely above a whisper. "Tom, please. I love you. We all love you. This isn't the way to love." Tom's interruption was like a slap. "You want to talk about love? Then, let's discuss how love is expressed in this family. Through careful inclusion in third-tier carriages? Through polite acknowledgement at formal events? Through birthday cards that are obviously written by staff?" The attack on his mother seemed to be the breaking point for King Charles. His face showed an expression of anger and authority that reminded everyone present that despite the family drama, he was still the King of England. "You will stop this immediately," he commanded, his voice carrying the full weight of centuries of royal authority. "You are destroying everything we have worked to build, everything your mother has sacrificed for." But Tom was beyond the reach of royal commands now. The careful respect for authority that had governed his life for 48 years had been completely shattered, replaced by a raw honesty that recognized no boundaries. "Sacrificed?" Tom turned on his stepfather with an intensity that was frightening to witness. "You want to talk about sacrifice? Let's talk about what I've sacrificed. 20 years of my life trying to be the perfect stepson. 20 years of biting my tongue and accepting second-class treatment because I thought it was better for the family." The room was completely silent now, everyone transfixed by the raw emotion being displayed before them. This wasn't the carefully managed drama that occasionally played out in the tabloids. This was real human anguish being expressed in the most inappropriate setting imaginable. "And, for what?" Tom continued, his voice breaking slightly. "So that my children could grow up knowing they're not really part of this family? So that I could spend the rest of my life grateful for whatever scraps of inclusion you decided to throw my way?" The mention of his children seemed to tap into the deepest well of his pain. Several people in the room looked genuinely moved by the anguish in his voice, even as they remained horrified by the public nature of his breakdown. Prince William finally found his voice again, though it was strained and unfamiliar. "Tom, your children are part of this family. They always have been. This isn't about them, and you know it. Isn't it?" Tom challenged. "When was the last time any of them were included in a major royal event? When was the last time their accomplishments were acknowledged by this institution? They watch the news and see their cousins being celebrated while they're ignored, and you think that doesn't affect them?" The accusation hit home with devastating accuracy. Everyone in the room knew that Tom was speaking the truth about his children's peripheral status in the royal family, and the guilt was visible on several faces. But, even as Tom scored these emotional victories, it was becoming clear that his outburst had passed the point of no return. The damage he was causing to family relationships, to the monarchy's reputation, and to his own future within the institution was becoming irreparable with each passing moment. The irony was not lost on anyone present that Tom's desperate attempt to claim his place in the royal family was actually ensuring that he would be excluded from it forever. His public breakdown was providing all the justification needed for cutting him out of future events, for treating him as exactly the kind of liability he had accused them of seeing him as. As the confrontation reached its climax, with Tom having finally said everything he had been holding back for 20 years, the room began to fill with a different kind of silence. It was the silence that follows a natural disaster, when people begin to assess the damage and wonder how they will ever rebuild what has been destroyed. Tom Parker Bowles stood in the center of it all, no longer the angry man seeking justice and recognition. Now he looked like what he actually was, a broken human being who had just destroyed the very relationships he had been fighting to preserve. The royal family would survive this crisis, as they had survived so many others, but the cost of survival would be measured in permanently severed relationships and irreparably damaged trust. The Golden Room that had hosted centuries of royal celebrations would be remembered for this moment of devastating honesty, when careful diplomacy gave way to raw human emotion and the perfect facade of royal harmony finally cracked beyond repair.